Welcome to the first Open Shelf podcast, where we will explore ethical issues in librarianship. The Open Shelf podcast is created in partnership with CILIPS in Scotland and is supported by the University of Glasgow's Impact Acceleration Account, which is funded through the Arts and Humanities Research Council. I am Dr. David McNamara, Reader in Information Studies at the University of Glasgow. The recently published book, Feminist Librarianship, Principles, Practices and Provocations, edited by Kirsten, published by Facet Publishing, is rich, multi-layered and incredibly timely. The book covers everything from historical cliches to cutting-edge tech ethics and is a powerful exploration of the field through a feminist lens. I'm delighted to be joined by the editor of the book and author of two of the chapters, Kirsten McCorry. Kirsten is Sector Development Manager for CILIPS Scotland, the professional association for the nation's library staff. Kirsten is also a novelist, short story writer and poet who is passionate about amplifying the voices of hidden women in history. Her debut novel, Remember the Rowan, published by Ringwood in 2024 and Red Squirrel Press in 2025, was a finalist in the People's Book Prize and longlisted for the Highland Book Prize. Kirsten's work has also been published by New Writing Scotland, the Scottish Poetry Library, Gutter, Scottish Pen, the Women's History Network, Bluestocking Oxford, and numerous other outlets. Her work has also been shortlisted for a Vogue magazine Young Talent Award, selected as an editor's choice for the John Byrne Award, and twice winner of the Glasgow Women's Library Poetry Prize. A warm welcome, Kirsten.
Thank you, and thank you for that generous introduction, David.
Oh, you're very welcome. So, kick off with some opening questions then. You open the book noting that women constitute roughly 75% of library and information workers, yet their contributions remain systemically overlooked and undervalued. Why do you think a profession so heavily dominated by women is still so aggressively under-recognised?
Thanks, David, and I think that the word aggressively is jumping out at me there. Is it all just a huge coincidence? Does correlation imply causation? And actually, this question makes me think of right in my conclusion of the book, because you're quite right to point out that even whether we're thinking about economics or ethics, the lack of support that libraries all too often receive in society, it really doesn't add up. So here's an extract from the conclusion that I think might shed a little light on this question. Given the unparalleled offer outlined throughout the past pages, why are our beloved libraries under threat? Why is my profession, the vocation I love when raw self-interest would advise me otherwise, unsupported to such a devastating extent? The Scottish Book Trust research I first cited in Chapter 15 reveals that library funding has been slashed by 30% during a decade in which usage increased by over 40%. Why is our sector condemned to a vicious cycle of cuts that work for neither patrons nor professionals? Even rooted in the most ruthless economic outlook, how does such disparity make sense? In her new history of the Wages for Housework movement, Emily Kalachi summarises the work of feminist thinker and campaigner Silvia Federici, perhaps best known for her patriarchal capitalist critique, Caliban and the Witch, in which she connected the witch panics that savaged early modern Europe, worst of all in our homeland of Scotland, of course, where over 4,000 were accused, to the need to suppress women, dispossess them of knowledge, and render them into a resource to be universally exploited to support the nascent capitalist order. What is often dismissed as, in Kalachi's words, an irrational holdover from a superstitious pre-modern time, turns out not to have been a tragic accident. As we librarians would have it, not myth but disinformation, deliberately designed to disenfranchise, delegitimise and ultimately dehumanise women who, if equipped to exercise the full extent of their power, would represent a radical challenge to society's status quo. Now, yes, so it might be early doors in feminist librarianship discussion to be mentioning witchcraft accusations, persecutions, prosecutions, but it does, I hope, illuminate this dilemma we face in all this kind of advocacy. Are decision makers truly ignorant of the evidence base that we're offering them? Now, in good faith, we would hope that is the case, that they just haven't heard the message that we're sharing in our library advocacy of the difference that libraries, as you say, 75% women majority sector, are making to communities' lives. But there is increasingly that question of whether some decision makers today are all too aware of the impact that libraries can have on democratic literacy, on civic engagement, and so much more. So yes, the question remains, but certainly something that I and my contributors try to do throughout the book is make the implicit in this problem in this dilemma explicit, to recognise that when libraries do face cuts and closures, that impact is not just misguided, it is misogynistic, and the impact is disproportionately felt by the women and girls in our society.
Thank you, Kirsten. I was fascinated in the book by this thought that investment in libraries is investment in women. So it's a really kind of powerful thread throughout the book. Before I kind of touch on that again, you did note that this is the first book of its kind specifically dedicated to exploring feminist principles in library and information science within the UK. So what gaps, other than obviously the ones you've touched on already, were you kind of hoping to fill with the book?
Yeah, well, actually, I'll start by thinking of my inspiration shelf, and a book that I first read when preparing to lead the Not Our Job campaign, which I think we'll come on to a little bit later, was the Feminist Reference Desk. So this is an American publication, and it was brilliant inspiration, but it's grounded in academic libraries. So what feminist practice looks like in the academic library sector specifically. So for that reason, thinking about this in a UK context and how we could further that ripple effect, feminist librarianship principles, practices and provocation very deliberately speaks to a range of sectors. We've got everybody from public and academic guests, school libraries, youth libraries, law librarians, you name it. Health librarians also make a valuable appearance. So I think creating that kind of the whole is more than the sum of its parts effect, and making sure that all the sectors in which women's work is having such a transformative effect are represented. I think something else that I really wanted to acknowledge with the book is the unsung role of our women professionals in championing intellectual freedom. I know that's a cause very close to your own heart as the chair of the Intellectual Freedom Committee, David, and of course informing a lot of your research. And this is something that, again, I think a book, an anthology, a collection of women's writing, of women's reflections, can demonstrate this intellectual freedom in action, what this looks like, and why libraries are the perfect place to bring this together. So we have a really diverse range of viewpoints within the book, feminist lenses, feminist perspectives that complement, yes, but sometimes challenge and even downright conflict with my own. And that's what's so exciting. One of the main learning points for me has actually been how much the role of editor or editress mirrors the role of librarian, and embracing that plurality of views. I think is it tots and quotes the Latin phrase that there are as many opinions as there are men, and in the book there are definitely as many opinions as there are women as well. And last but certainly not least, I've touched on it already today, but really what I hope the book achieves, and it's offering whatever sector, whatever level of experience, wherever a reader finds herself or himself, is that advocacy angle, is getting that message to decision makers, to members of the public, to library patrons, as well as library professionals, that we are championing women's work, women's activities, women's impact every time we champion our libraries, and vice versa. If we want to achieve genuine gender equality in our society, we can't do that without strong and supported library services.
No, absolutely. The point around intellectual freedom, I think, came very strongly from the book, because the breadth of different topics covered across the book was really fantastic. It's extremely ambitious work, which was just fantastic to see. So just touching again on this investment in libraries, this investment in women concept, because it's such a strong thread in the book, could you unpack that as a core rallying cry? And how do budget cuts or the existential threats to local libraries disproportionately impact women and girls as both workers and patrons?
Absolutely. And you're right to identify it as the core rallying cry, again, across sectors, across seniorities, across levels of experience. And it's interesting because although my instinct is to break it down and to drill into this divide between patron and professional, I know for a lot of women who contributed to the book, myself very much included, the personal is professional, as well as the personal being political, which is a pretty iconic feminist essay. For myself included, I am a library patron as well as a library professional. And yet we know from the workforce perspective, the women who make up the majority of library workers, they are skilled, they are committed, they're uniquely committed indeed to our ethical framework, the ethical principles of which we've already touched upon. And from the patron perspective, libraries have a unique role to play in their communities by championing women's equality, women's empowerment, quite literally from the cradle to the grave, and hopefully that comes across in the diversity of content within the book. One example amongst many is the chapter by Pamela McLean as school librarian, a deep dive into attachment theory and the evidence base, really evidencing the case for the emotional regulation that, yes, the school library, but crucially the school librarian as a uniquely trusted figure offers indeed to all children, but recognising the wider patriarchal crisis in which our girls and young women are having to navigate, having to find themselves in, the vital, more vital now than ever, I would argue, role of that trusted school librarian, who again is disproportionately likely to be a woman herself. And then looking at every stage of a woman's life, a chapter that I was very keen to write myself is Bloody Brilliant Libraries, so all about menstrual and menopause literacy. And when we think about experiences of menopause, one of the fun icebreakers I like to do with webinars and workshops related to the book is actually inviting attendees to generate as many euphemisms for menstruation, for periods, as they can. And the board very, very quickly fills up. There's a fog of misinformation, a fog of mockery very often the women are having to navigate at what's already a challenging time of their lives. And again, libraries, whether it's menopause friendly collections, whether it is menopause cafes and playing host to that, providing evidence-based health and well-being information in a non-clinical, non-commercial setting is invaluable. So I think without libraries, women and girls' lives become materially worse. Conversely, they become so much better when we have strong and supported library services.
No, absolutely. I think the whole aspect of libraries and supporting well-being generally, I think you've touched on so many elements of that from a kind of feminist perspective. And certainly the chapter around Pamela's chapter, I think we'll touch on again later on. Moving on to the idea of debunking stereotypes and herstory rather than history, which I'll need to make sure I pronounce properly all the way through, because it's, again, it just reinforces the fact that we're not used to saying that word.
Yeah, and it's been a fun thing to play around with, actually, with language in the book. As you say, it is kind of, just a reminder that male need not and ought not be default. Of course, we discuss at great length, and I know you do this with your students all the time, what neutrality actually means in modern day librarianship. But thinking about, is it always history? Could it be herstory? Much to the entertainment of Facet Publishing, I called it, rather than calling it the master document, it became the mistress document. Thinking of my authoresses and myself as editress, again, just reinforcing this point of the power of language, which of course we know in the literal and literary business of words.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. It does. You take that step back when you read it. It makes you think about the use of language, because a word like history I'd never really queried in my own mind until I read your book. So, which is shameful for me to admit, but I genuinely hadn't queried it. It was a word I'd always used.
No, not at all.
So it genuinely helps you understand things a little bit better.
Makes us happy if there's from one word to two. This is what we're all about.
Absolutely, yeah. So you talk in chapter 1 about the cliches of men, lions, and holy women in the library world. Why do you think traditional library stereotypes so sticky, and how do they actively harm modern library professionals?
This is a great question. The reason we open with this chapter by Jennifer Horan, a superstar youth librarian, actually what was very apparent to me was how deep and how far back into herstory these stereotypes go. Now, I love a cardigan, don't get me wrong. I'm probably in many ways a kind of very traditional librarian because, as you've mentioned, I have my career as an author as well, very passionate about the classic side of our work. Yes, we're more than books, but books are bloody brilliant in their own right. But Jennifer's chapter is really invigorating and illuminating in how it confronts these stereotypes being in there from the get-go, and this is something that continues. We then move to Cleo O'Callaghan-Yeoman's chapter, and then our very own podcast producer, Leah Higgins. Leah has played the role of new professional advisor throughout the book, and her first of two chapters is that history and notes from a new professional perspective, which were invaluable indeed throughout the book. But all the way through, we see that what these stereotypes do about what a librarian, again, disproportionately likely to be a woman, can or can't achieve, can or can't do for her community and in her community, that they reduce that. They create barriers when we're in the business of dismantling them. They narrow our horizons and they tell us, yes, what can be done, what can't be done. And we know there are definitely challenges to be had in the way that librarianship's remit has crept and has expanded in recent years. But the silver lining of that has demonstrated what these professionals can do, the power that they can have. Again, going back to that uniquely trusted relationship, we know from Ipsos Mori polling data that librarians are consistently amongst the top 3 most trusted professions in the UK. Incidentally, when we ever share that stat with politicians, they ask us where they rank, and it gets pretty awkward pretty quick. But I think really what comes across, whether we are talking about stereotypes in the medieval era, whether we're talking about stereotypes generated by AI in to-the-minute life and even beyond, it's reductive and therefore misogynistic, and we just don't need it, because the one message that I take away from the book, from what my authoresses have shared with me, is that there are no limits to what women librarians can achieve and make happen for the communities they serve.
Well, I mean, absolutely, it's damaging for feminism, but actually, ultimately, it's damaging for the entire sector. Because if stereotypes are so loosely played with, then everyone, the entire society gets impacted by that. Um, what's also obviously clear from the book, and those of you who listening who don't know, this is a book that obviously emerged from a lot of previous work that you've done. So you've got CILIPS Winspiration program, for instance. So how has uncovering the hidden histories of iconic LIS women changed the way new professionals view their own career paths? So you've done the Winspiration work. It's led to this, much deeper treatment via the book.
Yeah, Winspiration actually began in November 2021. So although the book is very much hot off the press, just a Women's History Month, March 2026, as you're listening now, the spirit, as you say, the work that's gone into it has actually been half a decade in the making. That first Winspiration webinar was led by Dr. Adele Patrick, the co-founder and co-director of Glasgow Women's Library. And I quite naively thought this will just be a cheerleading experience. This will be me offering a kind of rallying cry to the sector to encourage women in their work. But actually, what Adele immediately illuminated was what a deep place we could reach. So her provocation for attendees then was, what would libraries led by feminists look like? So yes, it's very much informed by her history and the sobering realisation of how little women's work has historically been valued, however we want to define valuing. And when Adele offered that provocation to her attendees, the floodgates opened. The suggestions, the energy in the virtual room was incredible. We had a Padlet to capture this all, and it was everything from ergonomics to, again, how we tell the story of our profession itself. One highlight amongst many in Winspiration that came a little later was the story of decolonisation pioneer Dorothy Porter. Now, this is something that we wrestle with constantly as a profession, how to navigate the limitations of, I'm going to use the word history here, a very patriarchal, a very colonially informed history shaping kind of what knowledge we value and why. And yet Dorothy Porter, a good century before most of the sector, most of the world woke up to the value of this work, was curating her collections in such a creative, invigorating way to represent her own communities. So there have been so many highlights. And I mean, I'd be delighted actually to turn over to Leah. I know she's very busy with the tech side of this podcast as well. Multi-talented new professionals emerging in our ranks every day. But I think I remember when I was lucky enough to be on the CILIP 125 list, a fellow medalist said, it's being part of something that has a past but also a future. And that's really what I hope female new professionals will take from the book. But yeah, I'd be delighted to hear your thoughts on that, Leah, as a new professional yourself.
When I first started kind of researching my chapters, it was very clear to me that a lot of the kind of past of the profession had been written by men. And it was very much a kind of, I talk about it in the chapter, it's a bit like the profession was thought of as a piece of hand-me-down clothing, something that never really quite fits you correctly. And it felt like there was maybe some kind of bleed over from that in kind of current ways that we think about librarianship, and that became quite clear to me. And it's not really until you start to examine these things, especially when you're a new professional entering into any sector, you kind of just take it as it is. The status quo is just the status quo, and you don't really know to question things to a certain extent. Even, I come from a history of art background, and you're taught to think critically about things and you're taught to question things, but you don't necessarily do it, especially when you think about any profession. You think about the labour that you're putting in, you think about your professionalism. You're doing it to have a career, but you're also doing it to make a living and do all these other things, and you're balancing, especially when you're a new professional, who you're becoming and where you're going to live and what you're going to do and all these sort of things. So, then questioning something that has such a kind of privileged but also such a kind of lengthy history is not necessarily the first thing on your agenda. And I think that's what led me into writing the chapter the way that I did, which is really kind of starting to examine these things and go, you know what, actually, I might be a new professional, but I also have the ability and the foresight and the kind of critical thinking skills to be able to question these things. And actually, I'm allowed to do that. And I think even just being able to kind of have the opportunity to contribute to the book, and knowing the kind of the way that everyone was thinking about contributing to the book and kind of being a part of the legacy of that the book will now create, I think was a really positive experience for me. And it gave me that little bit of confidence to know that I had the ability to question these things.
Yeah, that point about emotional labour, Leah, is so resonant, and also legacy, because that's what we ultimately hope for. This is the first word in feminist librarianship, but certainly, I think we all hope is not the last. My literary mentor, Sarah Sheridan, she's always making the point when it comes to women's stories, whether we tell them in fact, fiction, something in between, is that we don't want to just be running to stand still. We don't want to be continually in class 101. Have you heard about this incredible woman? How has she fallen off the historical radar? In fact, we build on this knowledge. We're in the business, we're in the sector of knowledge sharing. And as I conclude the book, inviting readers to borrow generously from the issues, insights, and inspiration we've offered, learning from the women who walked the library floor before us to motivate and mentor those following in our footsteps. I think intergenerational feminism is so key, again, now more than ever. And hopefully the book is the first offering, certainly not the last in that when it comes to our sector.
Oh, absolutely. And it's so important that this concept of what we leave behind as professionals and as institutions as well, isn't it? Librarianship's such an old profession. And it's not just about, the moment, it's about actually what we leave for the people who follow behind us. And, books like this are so important in that regard. I guess from both your perspectives, when you entered the profession, was it a surprise in terms of any discoveries around how feminist concepts were approached within the profession? Did you have an expectation that it was better than it is, or were you kind of both aware of it?
There were definitely some surprises. Leah, I'm thinking goats, and you can take it from here.
Yeah, I think when I started to research my chapter, I thought, where is the most obvious place that I can start coming from the professional association that is CILIPS? And it was the newsletters, and we hold the kind of physical printed newsletters in our archive downstairs. When I started to look through, I tried to find just any stories about women in the profession, even, if you think about the first and second waves of feminism and discussions about women's place in the sector, or even women were entering into the profession in much kind of higher volume in like the First and Second World Wars and things like that, and there was just nothing. The reference to goats is about the fact that there was actually a reference to a goat eating a book in Kirkcudbright, and the fact that had made it into the newsletter, but there was zero discussions of women. And actually the only discussions that there were was retirement notices or the marriage notices of women who were working behind the library desk. And so it was very much, as I say in the chapter, like women leaving the profession was the only kind of significant part of that story, and it really felt quite wrong to me. So that was quite surprising to think that there hadn't. We think so clearly about it, and obviously me coming into the profession, entering into the job that I'm in now, with Kirsten as my line manager, with the Winspiration programme already having been a kind of well-established thing within the sector. It seems, you never really want to look back on these times with a kind of modern insistence, but it's kind of hard not to do that. So it was quite surprising to me that there was zero discussions and that nobody was thinking there's a huge gap here that's really not being filled in by anyone. And yeah, I think it's interesting to examine that, and I go into a wee bit more depth about that in the chapter itself.
Yeah, and coming again from an art historical background, which we both do in different ways, you call it negative space, don't you? And that's, it's the silences speak every bit as loud as what the records do tell us. I think for me as well, a big part of my role has always been reporting to the CILIPS trustee board, looking at our demographics. And of course, when I see a stat like 75% women, you think, wonderful, something to celebrate and something to kind of power and catalyse our advocacy. And yet, as I open the book, it is tongue-in-cheek, but the response is quite often, oh, well, how do we entice more men into librarianship? How do we make it more appealing to men? Now, I don't know if you've ever met a man, David, but they're not renowned for being shy or indeed for missing a trick. And I mean that as a compliment, fellas. I mean the fact that you are our kind of canaries in the coal mine. If a job is not well paid and not well respected, then, I think the absence of male colleagues speaks for itself. So that's certainly not something that keeps me awake at night. Oh, how are we going to entice more men in? It's how we're going to value librarianship to the degree that it deserves. And I think the chaps will take care of themselves.
Oh yeah, I think it's inculcated in men from a very young age to be that, isn't it? To always kind of take on the next opportunity, and it's often to our detriment, has to be said. I was just wondering actually when you were both discussing that aspect of things, because historically, librarianship has had an issue with fiction, a thing called the Great Fiction Question, which historically librarianship in the old days in the Victorian era didn't like to be seen to be lending fiction books. I wonder, there's an element of that in it, because I know, certainly having studied English literature, the idea of the novel being a feminine form and therefore less worldly in societal eyes is, maybe there's a legacy of that. I don't know what you both, and obviously, Kirsten, you're a novelist.
I am, yes. I've got skin in the game, both sides here. But yeah, I mean, again, chapter 2, Cleo's chapter really delves into this in such a creative way, looking at the Books and Borrowing database from the University of Stirling, and the value of that. I think, again, speaking to what we've already been touching on, how we tell women's stories now. Yes, actually, I'm biased, but I think fiction is a key way to do that as part of a feminist practice, because fiction, above all else, is an exercise in empathy. It's, in the words of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, it's not just to say what happened, but how it felt. That's certainly what I try and do in my own historical fiction. But what Cleo illuminates through her chapter is what the library records themselves can tell us about women. And when she's looking at the long 18th century, the other sources that women had at their disposal to tell their stories in their own terms, in their own language, in ways that matter to them, are relatively few and far between. So again, the power of the library record, as well as the power of the library, to give that woman access to the knowledge and to the stories in its widest possible sense that matter to her and that would shape her future. It's a really, really valuable chapter as well. Very, very exciting. Much like Leah herself, I think Cleo is a new professional star to look out for. We're going to see brilliant things from them both in the coming years, I've no doubt.
Yeah, I think borrow records are fascinating. It was a really interesting chapter, and it's good to see more research in that space, because it really does give you an insight into, what people's concerns were in different periods of time, and what they had access to, if nothing else. So it really is a genuinely important area of research. So yeah, moving on to this idea of radical and intersectional spaces. So chapters 8 and 9 explore attachment theories you already mentioned in school libraries and the serious work of play. So how can a feminist framework help librarians create school and public spaces where young girls feel uniquely safe, seen and empowered?
I'm so glad that you've honed in on these chapters. And of course, choosing my favourites, it's like favourites amongst your children. You just don't do it. But these are two standouts for me. Francesca Boyd-Thorpe, firstly, looking at, as you say, the serious work of play. What Frankie does, and again, a really intelligent, really creative way, is fuse her scholarly background in play therapy with her experiences as a school and youth librarian, and articulating the kind of quiet revolutionary power of, yes, the library, but crucially the librarian, to provide children. And it includes, we discussed this in the chapter title, and we came to conclude that the best way to put it was tomorrow's feminists. Now, of course, they can be either sex, any gender, but tomorrow's feminists, and the value of that trusted professional from the earliest years to create a quietly nurturing, quietly supportive space. At its best, perhaps it's not noticed by the powers that be, perhaps it's not noticed when it comes to the threat of these supposedly soft cuts and closures, but utterly invaluable to the neurological, to the psychological, to the emotional development of that young person. And I think, again, when we're thinking about the wider misogyny of society, that's the case in point, that this work isn't more celebrated. Again, disproportionately women who are delivering it. And that's completely echoed by Pamela's chapter. I've already mentioned it once today, but such a standout in how Pamela fuses the existing evidence base of attachment theory, but looks at it through a feminist lens. And she speaks very powerfully and poignantly to her own experience, as tangibly as things like when she was commissioned to write the chapter, she bought herself a new keyboard, only to find that it didn't fit her hand size, that it's designed for the average man, not the average woman. And the subliminal signal, in fact, is it that subliminal, or is it quite explicit, that this isn't for you, that this world isn't for you, that this work isn't for you? So what Pamela does is, looking through attachment theory, thinking about actually what headspace, and I mean that in a very real sense, do young people need to be in order to learn. They need to be emotionally regulated. And again, we talk about it all the time at CILIPS, the school library as a safe space, but it can become almost a truism. It can become a phrase that we throw around, but what's the evidence? And this is exactly what Pamela provides for us. Thinking about, again, the neurological, the psychological, the emotional evidence that to re-regulate, to emotionally regulate, young people need a safe space and they need a safe person. Again, going back to the critical importance of the librarian as a uniquely trusted adult in their life, who isn't asking anything of them, who isn't putting any pressure on them, but is there to guide them as is needed. And And so there's such a valuable advocacy opportunity offered by chapters like that. And of course, I'm speaking about all young people there. They all need to emotionally regulate. Indeed, all of us at any age need to be emotionally regulated, to not go into our threat system, to not shut down, to be able to take in the knowledge that our libraries offer. But again, something that Pamela articulates really powerfully is the disproportionate hostility, the wider world that young women and girls are encountering in the worst case scenarios within the school, but certainly beyond. We don't have much control over that online or offline, unfortunately. So the threats that they are fending off day after day, night after night, makes that safe space and that safe person, the trusted school librarian, all the more critical. So excited for readers to encounter these chapters and the evidence that's informing things that we've known intuitively, but again, getting it on the shelf, getting it captured, getting it codified for future generations of professionals is so exciting.
Well, yeah, so important. Certainly, of all the review workshops I've done, one of the themes that keeps coming out is this idea of the physical space and how important it is to patrons. And the more we talk about it, and the more we kind of try and, as you say, codify it and make it real, because it is a concept I think that can be very, very broad, but it needs kind of genuine meat put on the bone so that people understand actually what it means and how important it is to people.
Completely. It really emerged. And actually, I think your own research is cited quite a few times, David, within the book, because exactly that, when we think about post-pandemic, yes, libraries were really leaning into the technological innovation to continue our reach, to reach our communities. But we saw that real resurgence in public demand and public support and public enthusiasm for the physical space. And whether that is for our early learners in school libraries, that's menopause and menstrual literacy in public libraries, climate action as well. And again, what the library offers is as a unique space for combining evidence-based information with trusted community. Again, non-clinical, non-commercial, it's unparalleled and it's ever rarer in our society. One of the most exciting elements of bringing the book together was the opportunity to interview Professor Kathleen Riach of your own institution of the University of Glasgow. She works at the Adam Smith Business School and is really a world-leading expert on menopause matters, on menopause literacy. And so she visits workplaces around the world. And what she reported to me was that librarians take this for granted. You think this is what all workplaces, this is what all communities are offered. Nothing could be further from the truth. And whether you were wanting to charge companies thousands in consultancy fees or just really gain the credit that we deserve for what could be an amazing ripple effect, amazing impact that's happening in libraries day in, day out, unsung, often unsupported, but invaluable. It's so apparent that the physical space is the literal and figurative centre of a lot of this feminist work.
Oh, yeah, very much so. And I think it all, as you say, it came out of the research I did with Ian Ruffin and Elaine Robinson around the pandemic in libraries. And one of the things we did was do a YouGov survey. And I remember one of the quotes that came from the YouGov survey was a young mum who'd really felt heartbroken that she'd missed the chance to take her new baby to the library, while it was closed. And so like just little anecdotes like that just make you realise how important it is to people's lives, to having that community space where they feel they can have a shared experience with other young mums or other people in the community. We have a fantastic example of feminist practice and librarianship in Scotland, right in the city, apart from your good selves, of course. But the Glasgow Women's Library obviously features in Chapter 12. For listeners who might not be familiar with the Glasgow Women's Library, what makes it, the partnership model that they have, an exceptional blueprint for intentionally inclusive feminist practice?
Oh, Glasgow Women's Library. How do I love the, let me count the ways. Honestly, at this point, I have to kind of limit myself for how often I feature them as a case study because they're just so darn good. But thankfully, when it comes to feminist librarianship, there were no limits whatsoever. I mentioned that Adele was the very first leader of a Winspiration webinar, and it was such a delight to invite her back, characteristically in concert and collaboration with her team. So that shows the way they work, not just what they do, but how they do it. It's collaborative, it's co-created. So that is really a standout chapter. Exactly as you say, David, how lucky we are to be right here in Glasgow, to have an apex of feminist learning, feminist knowledge sharing indeed. So they cover everything from volunteers and what actually makes a good volunteer. And again, the kind of patriarchal lines upon which this has historically been defined and how we can expand our impact further by challenging it. Thinking about adult literacy and numeracy and not judging what a patron turns to us for, what skills they're looking to learn and why, and really the transformative effect that the library can have. And everything from, again, thinking about jury and classifications, what I mentioned earlier about Dorothy Porter, but that's so in evidence by their amazing librarian Wendy Kirk and her contribution to the chapter about what a feminist classification system actually looks like in practice. So that's, one standout amongst many. And another, thinking further about partnership working, is a chapter by Jill Ryan. Now, it's a hotly contested contents page for the best chapter title, but I think misinformation is definitely up there. And this is all about her work as a skilled Wikimedian in Perth libraries. And again, just that knowledge sharing, that knowledge co-creation. So how libraries digitally, but also physically, can capture voices historically or historically unheard, whilst also growing skills. So the ripple effects continue and continue, featuring a plurality of voices from across the community in a local sense, also in a global sense when it comes to something like Wikimedia, but with the library always at the centre of it. So I think in different ways, those chapters really complement one another and show just what feminist practice can look like and what it can deliver for patrons.
It really is. It's an exceptional library. Glasgow Women's Library, and globally recognised as such as well, isn't it? They get so many visitors and people who want to spend time there to see how it works. It's fantastic.
They do. I'm tempted to do, if you take one thing away from this, and I've already said that about 5 times, but yes, please do pay a visit to Glasgow Women's Library if you haven't already. That's the warmest welcome, quite literally, because you will also get a cup of tea, and you will see, again, thinking of intergenerational feminism, the women on the shelf, women on the walls, the stories and the way that knowledge is shared and curated and preserved for generations to come. It really is outstanding. Glasgow Women's Library was actually my late grandmother's childhood library when she was growing up in Bridgeton. So it's very dear to my heart for a number of reasons. Also, the first place that my writing was ever featured, so I cannot praise them highly enough. They're also now Scotland's first official library of sanctuary. So whatever walk of life has brought you to their door, you can be assured of a warm welcome.
I worked in Bridgeton Library for a short period when I was in practice. So yeah, absolutely. It's a fantastic building. Oh, Carnegie, I think, isn't it?
It is. It's gorgeous. And my grandma would recall that they used to have a gate that would divide the children's and the adults collection back in the days where we, doing everything we can to stop children being in the library. And that gate is still there, but fortunately it is kept very much open now. So there are no barriers to what you can learn and what you can access in the Women's Library now.
And also very easy to get transport to as well. So
exactly. This is something, again, see, I'm just singing their praises all the time, but one of the other chapters I was really keen to write within the book was all about eco-feminist leadership in libraries and the Green Libraries work, again, the really unique link between libraries and sustainability. And yet again, Glasgow Women's Library are coming to the fore, are a brilliant example of professional practice. They have a green creative cluster, and just, combining everybody from their board to volunteers and all the folks in between, just literally growing as well as figuratively growing the community and growing their skills too. So you can also visit the outside as well as the inside now. It's an amazing space.
Yeah, absolutely echo that. So I'm going to go on to the topic of men, I'm afraid, just for a short period of time. So the concepts obviously of toxic masculinity and allyship, which is obviously the more positive element of masculinity. But obviously you have chapters in there by Sean McNamara, Cavan P. Stafford, and also Anis Kazak also talks about toxic masculinity. And this idea of sexism in LIS, it's not just women's work, inverted commas. So how can male colleagues step up effectively without overshadowing the female workforce?
Yeah, I think this is such an important message to come out. I love men. I love them so much. I even keep one at home. And as I've mentioned in my introduction, everybody should be part of this revolution. It's never been more necessary. I'm often paraphrasing the author David Mitchell at the conclusion of Cloud Atlas. Yes, we're all just a drop in the ocean, yet what is any ocean but a multitude of drops? And that's the spirit by which we really want our allies to be stepping up. So it's so exciting. I think to have these chapters mirroring, Anais, as a feminist librarian herself, was talking about the Lighting Up Lives project in Renfrewshire and Glasgow school libraries and inviting male authors in to role model alternatives to toxic masculinity in really exciting ways. And yes, absolutely, you don't just need to take my word for it, because we have Cavan, a facet author in his own right, and Sean, CILIPS director, co-authoring, co-creating that chapter all about a call to action to colleagues, and very evocatively titled, There's more than one way to be a man. So actually, Sean, I could hand over to you at this point, be interested in your thoughts and your reflections in the chapter about, the difference that male colleagues can make to this work.
Thank you, Kirsten. And yeah, it was a real honour to be asked to contribute a chapter to this fantastic book, and was in incredible company. And all praise to Kirsten and Leah and everyone involved for the incredible product at the end of the day that sets out so many different visions and opinions. And I had to think from my point of view, what could I add that wasn't taking up the space of another incredible woman who could be taking that chapter. And what I wanted to do was perhaps do what we often do as part of librarianship and as part of our journey to becoming librarians, is to reflect on our position. And I think, in my experience, I think men will often have a lot of opinions on different equality issues, as they should, and that's fantastic, but sometimes can be a little bit quiet on issues around gender equality or feminism or the differentials between male and female roles in any profession, but in particular in librarianship, where, as we've discussed already today, those stark differences between the number of women in the profession, but then the number of women in senior roles. So that made me definitely reflect on what that meant for me, because I'm someone who has been in senior roles in only over 2 jobs in librarianship. But what that means, and I think looking back, it made me think that when I first left library school, taught by our host today, David, I moved into a job in a public library. I was very conscious of the fact that I was 27, 28 at that time, and was suddenly put in a middle management role where the people who worked for me were people who were tended to be older than me, and what that meant, and because I had a professional qualification, I could do that. That was on my mind. I don't think it ever really crossed my mind at that point, perhaps through youth and naivety, that I was also a man, and most of the people in those positions were female, and the large part of the workforce where the professionals were a mixture of male and female. But the kind of library assistants, a lot of the people who were on the lower levels, were far more majority female. So what does that mean? What that must have looked like to them? So I was trying to reflect in my chapter on what perceptions of librarianship are. Growing up, what I perceived it as, and I think definitely librarianship is one of those. There's a lot of cliches around it, how it's perceived as part of in the media, and it's one of the ones that's hardest to turn around. I think people have this very cliched vision of what a librarian looks like, and that really also affects how the profession is seen through the gender lens as well. So yeah, so hopefully I tried to explore some of those things, also modern things. What is AI saying about librarians, and still you see that kind of that thing that AI does, where it perpetuates stereotypes. So because there are more women in those roles and some of those cliched images, that can then get further generated through AI searches, and that can make that more of a problem. And then the other part of my chapter, I just thought I didn't want to be a man mansplaining. That's the last thing we needed. But I thought maybe it's okay if I'm mansplaining to other men, because then that creates a balance. So just setting out in my experience of what might be useful things for men to do, in terms of just exactly what we said, being a better ally and being someone that is not trying to just see it as women's work and saying, well, that's something. And it's something, with this book itself, it'd be really interesting to see how many men are reading it, and if not, why not, and how can we get more men reading it, how can we get men, or at least listening to things like this, so they can get some of those ideas across. And also, one of the other things I was trying to put across, something I've always tried to do, is create more opportunities for women. If you are a man in a senior role and your team is female or predominantly female, and then how can you ensure there's more opportunities? But also, I think one of the challenges we've had in librarianship over the last few years is because there has been a real reduction in middle management roles because of cuts and reductions in staff or deprofessionalisation. How do you make sure that you're giving people opportunities, but that they can then use them to get a better job, not just, look, here's something great that you can do, but you're still going to be getting paid the same. You're then doing that extra work, and there's a balance to be found with that. And unless we do what one of the main things the book's asking for, is value librarianship better, so that then there's more opportunities, more funding, and therefore there can be much more opportunities for women to hold those senior positions. One of the great things, I think, in Scotland is we have some of the best female leaders that we can have in some of the most senior roles. Scotland is definitely an exemplar of in some places how you can get that balance a bit better. But there's absolutely a lot of work to do on that.
No, I think it's men's job to keep men in check and to be the role models for each other. And I think you do that brilliantly in Scotland. So you've always been great at that, I think.
Yeah, that really comes across in the chapter, and I'm just going to continue my womansplaining to say how much I appreciate it, Sean, and David yourself as well. I think both of you have championed me every step of the way, Leah too, and it really does make a difference. We had a feminist librarianship workshop just yesterday, and there were a number of men in the room, and we were having a very kind of authentic, real discussion of how confronting this can be and the defensiveness that can arise. So I think, yeah, if in doubt, if looking for a model of what feminist librarianship looks like for a man, then they could do a lot worse than delving into your own chapter, Sean, and the way in which you've championed Winspiration and championed me since the very, very start, and listened to this no end, and we're listening to it even now. But as the professional association, hopefully the ripple effects from that will continue. And as Sean notes, we are so uniquely fortunate in Scotland at this moment to have figures like Amina Shah, who the National Librarian of Scotland, who very generously wrote the foreword to feminist librarianship, Ali Nolan, the CEO of the Scottish Library and Information Council, who I interviewed for ecofeminism. So the examples abound, and again, it goes back to that knowledge sharing, which hopefully we are starting and continuing to do as the professional association.
No, I think Scotland being a smaller country means that the role models can become more tangible for you. I remember when I was at library school, the names were kind of the London names, and so you didn't really know who they were. So when you eventually did meet them, it was a bit scary. Whereas in Scotland, you three aren't scary. So and thank you for coming along to speak to our students. Actually, no, sadly not. But yeah, so I think it does when you see kind of leaders who are accessible. I think it's a big fill up for new young professionals to not feel as intimidated as they might by someone who's far away and feels kind of a little bit disconnected from them.
Yeah.
Which is great. Yeah, moving on to the hiring aspect of this. So obviously you've written about the paradox where job advertisements in the 75% female sector often state that applications from men are particularly welcomed as an underrepresented group. So again, that's diversity, I guess. How do we balance genuine diversity goals with the risk of rewarding a glass escalator for men in a female-dominated space?
Glass escalator. I want to say I love that. I hate it, but I love it as well as a phrase. And this was actually one of your students, David, that pointed this out to me. That she was noting that, she felt very much the calling to be a feminist librarian, and yet she was seeing these job adverts, yes, where men were particularly welcomed because, poor souls, you're so underrepresented in librarianship. What is to be done?
I think having not looked for a job for a long time, I had no idea that it was actually a thing. That's I find that crazy.
Yes, me too. And she three, I think. So again, it was a very a fun discussion with a lot of realness at its heart. And actually, the main thing it makes me reflect on, because we've already discussed, as I've said, I think men are the canaries in the coal mine when it comes to professional status. If something isn't sufficiently valued, yes, it becomes women's work. It becomes naturally women's work, and therefore underpaid, undervalued accordingly by everybody from the local decision makers right up to national and even international level. Actually, I think it illuminates something that I'm sure we'll touch on before we close, which is the difference between kind of when we think of the technological revolution that we're living through, innovation, and kind of the value judgments, indeed the judgment overall, that only a human can bring to this kind of work, because it's not just about the numbers. And this, I think, applies to all EDI. It's not just about who is missing or what is missing and why. And actually, yeah, if we look, yes, men are technically underrepresented in librarianship, as Leah's historical chapter illuminates. This wasn't always the case, and indeed it isn't the case around the world, especially when we look at the most senior positions. And yet there's something here, but I believe what it's telling us, as I said, this got cited in a bookseller article that I was lucky enough to write as an opinion piece before the book came out. It doesn't keep me awake at night, the idea that there are boys and men out there that are just not fulfilling their lifelong dreams of librarianship. What does keep me awake at night is the fact that this sector is chronically underfunded, undervalued, and yeah, the fact that it's in a Venn diagram, it intersects very, very neatly with women's work. That doesn't feel like a coincidence, as we kicked off our discussion with. So I think that's, yes, we know the what of who's missing, but that for me is the why, and definitely illuminates stuff that we want to tackle, but perhaps not in the way we're used to thinking of tackling these EDI questions.
No, you've set me up beautifully, actually, for the next question, which is perhaps a sector that is extremely masculine and perhaps overvalued because it makes so much money for people. But the tech bros and tech generally, and ethics of tech, Dr. Emily Monroe's chapter in your book looks at why ethical AI can't be left to tech bros. Given that AI development is heavily male-dominated and frequently perpetuates gender biases, what unique ethical framework do feminist librarians bring to data literacy?
Yes, that is I keep saying this is my favourite chapter. They're all my favourite chapters. Emily's was actually the last to go into the book because I had interviewed her for ecofeminism and we had such a wide-ranging discussion, very much delving into AI, the sustainability, but also the ethical quandaries that it presents, that I couldn't resist inviting her back for a chapter in her own right. And of course, Emily is a novelist herself now, so it's an incredibly well-written, really thoughtful and thought-provoking offering. And actually, I'm delving into that interview as much as her chapter here, because one of the books that we discussed, if anybody out there is looking for a reading recommendation, you could do a lot worse than The New Age of Sexism by Laura Bates. This is all about how the AI revolution is reinventing misogyny. And we talked about, for example, one ChatGPT-powered search consumes close to 10 times the electricity of a traditional search. And a data center complex of Meta, for example, requires the same annual energy as 7 million laptops running through an 8-hour working day. Now, with 96% of AI-generated deepfakes proven to be non-consensual pornography, 99% of which features women, and despite us, as you note, David, at the beginning, us constituting just 12% of AI researchers, commentators like Bates rightly challenge us to imagine how much of that power we are burning just to satisfy the misogynistic fantasies of predatory men. So that sits in stark contrast to the humanity. I mean, you can see through systems like that, through technology like that, women are not even seen as human. And yet the humanity Emily illuminates in her own AI chapter, it's again, navigating the nuances and the complexities. It's not doomsaying, it's not utopian, it's ethical. And again, we are a profession quite uniquely committed to our ethical framework. So it's about putting people before profit. And again, the unique role of the library as somewhere non-clinical, non-commercial professions, as I say, who are committed to an ethical framework and therefore really have a vital, integral role to play in that. Again, so often with feminist librarianship, it's not just what the work is, but how that work is done. And Emily articulates that beautifully. And also highlights, therefore, the co-benefits that feminist practice so often brings for all. I think many of us look at this AI landscape, how overwhelming, how intimidating, how frightening it is, including our patrons, and think there must be an alternative way. We don't want to be Luddites necessarily, but nor do we want this creep of technology that we don't understand and has no ethical underpinning. So a feminist lens, as so often, will bring benefits for all. And that's something Emily articulates in a really, really incredible way within the book.
Oh, very much so. And last year when we had all the issues around, I think it was particularly X, where photographs were manipulated and deeply pornographic images of women were being created. It's like the fact that the system didn't stop that happening automatically when it was so offensive, but actually also illegal. It just seemed, that's an afterthought. You just think, well, what else is an afterthought at that level? It's actually genuinely scary.
Yeah. In fact, it makes me delving back into my conclusion here, because thinking, as we have throughout this conversation, about advocacy and why librarianship is not supported to the degree that it deserves, when we're thinking, again, I'm turning to Laura Bates's work here, the misogyny and the exponentially growing threat of digital sexual violence that our political decision makers are facing. There was a 2024 investigation found, exactly as you're highlighting, 400 easily accessible, deepfake, non-consensual pornographic images and videos of female MPs, female cabinet ministers, including at that time the Deputy Prime Minister. So yeah, we want to halt the digital world's dystopian descent as male abusers exploit it, just as tale as old as time, they've long sought to exploit women ourselves. And that depends now more than ever on the skilled, ethical information professionals like those who feature in the book. Returning to Jill Ryan's chapter as a Wikimedian, her and her colleagues are committed to making the internet less sexist, one edit at a time. So never tell me that librarianship is unambitious.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, if the values of librarianship were applied to AI, I think we wouldn't see those things happening in the first place. So I think there's a lot of scope there to expand our ethical You touched earlier as well, Kirsten, on the Not Our Job campaign. So obviously under your leadership, CILIPS became the first professional association in Europe to take a public stand against sexual harassment in libraries. So how does safety from online and offline misogyny tie into the day-to-day ethics of modern librarianship?
Yeah, so thank you for mentioning Not Our Job. This was a campaign, it was for the International Day of the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls, 25th of November 2022. And the reason for that particular Winspiration webinar was that research conducted by Brooke Canby had highlighted that sexual harassment of library workers was more prevalent than had been historically thought. And I'm sure, I know I speak for everybody in the room today, and certainly all those listening, I'm sure when I say that, you know, even one incident is one too many. So through that webinar, we were looking at what this looks like in professional practice, how we as a profession, as a collective can challenge it. And again, that informed Sean and Cavan's chapter about, acknowledging that the problem exists, believing women when they disclose this sort of harassment, indeed any sort of harassment, and challenging it when you see it, when you hear it, when you read it. So I think in the 4 years since, have things got any better? Certainly the wider world, I would argue, has got worse, as I mentioned there with Laura Bates and what we're seeing. And actually the decision makers who are best placed to make a world a better place for women and girls, and for all of us who want to see feminist progress, are under threats, the like of which we've never seen before. And I think, again, touching on intellectual freedom as a cause that's close to all our professional hearts, it has an absolutely chilling effect when we see the digital violence that women, again, disproportionately. Now, it's a wild west out there overall for any of us who want to volunteer an opinion, but particularly for women and girls, because you have this tinge of violence that we have long known and long faced, now giving an AI spin. It really does have a chilling effect on women's freedom of expression, on women's intellectual freedom, which just completely challenges all the ethics, all the principles, all the values that librarians hold dear. So once again, I think we've touched a lot on the physical space, and I completely stand by its unique value for community. But I think we also want to see librarians coming to the fore in these debates, in these discussions, and representing somewhere where differences of opinion can be held in tension if necessary, but in mutual respect, and things can be expressed, views can be shared in a way that contributes to diversity, contributes to plurality. That hasn't always been the case, but I think librarians are uniquely equipped, especially bearing in mind our ethical framework. So whether it's the physical community living room or whether it's the virtual one, I think we have an integral role to play here.
It's almost like we're regressing, isn't it? The technologies kind of not force us to regress, it's always a choice, but you know, things that are becoming common again were things that we absolutely did not do 10, 15 years ago. It's kind of scary to see how quickly things can regress.
Completely. And that's very much the case with feminist progress as well. You really don't want to be making the assumption that these things are linear. I know, even thinking about the generation of feminists that I come from, my mum or my late grandmother, actually women and girls, you know, especially the girls who are under, you know, school librarians like Pamela, like Frankie, what they're facing is things that in our worst nightmares we could never have encountered. So yeah, the rules change, but the more that changes, the more stays the same, unfortunately. But we certainly don't want to be resting on our laurels and assuming that progress is going to happen without us all making the collective effort to champion that progress.
Yeah, not very much. So it's a collective effort. So we're getting towards the end of the podcast now. So I wanted to kind of touch again on Leah's chapter, so maybe bring you both in this one. But obviously your chapter, Leah, looks at imposter syndrome among new professionals. But obviously, as we've talked about throughout the podcast, that we are in a systemically undervalued sector. So how do we differentiate between personal imposter syndrome and a workplace culture that's failing to validate workers? So obviously there's a tension there. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, that came up a lot in your conversations, didn't it, Leah?
Yeah, absolutely. I can think of, my conversations, the podcast chapter itself came out of the fact that that negative space that we spoke about earlier on, and we were having that consideration about how in the kind of modern day we then try and fill in that negative space to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And again, how can we examine something like imposter syndrome, which it feels like we were having lots of kind of like side conversations about imposter syndrome within the sector. And, we'd be chatting to each other like before events and before panels and things like that. And it was something that always kind of consistently came up, even if it wasn't necessarily being called imposter syndrome, it was very much identifiably what it was. And so it kind of became clear to me that the second chapter, which ironically enough was actually the first chapter I was asked to write for the book, it became clear to me that that's what that kind of needed to be about. And it was almost in a way kind of reclaiming a wee bit of that power as well, giving these women, the people that I interviewed within the chapter, space and time to be able to articulate these ideas and to be able to speak about imposter syndrome. Because I think also as well, that point that you touch on about personal versus professional, I very much didn't want to assume that anyone within the sector did feel imposter syndrome, because I think, as we explore in the chapter, quite often women are told that we feel it without necessarily knowing what it is or whether we do actually feel it. And then I think there's that kind of there's quite a kind of oppressive language about it, and that kind of being prescribed to you, which I think is wholly unhelpful, because there will be some people that enter into the sector or that have been in the sector for 20 years that just don't feel it. And I don't think that we should be telling them that they do. It does complicate the picture though, because I think there are people who, as I say, do feel it, but they maybe don't necessarily have the language to know that that's what it is. And then there's all these other kind of things at play. Even, earlier on we were having the discussion about going for roles and that sort of thing, and Sean was speaking about the kind of lack of middle management roles and things like that. And as someone that does quite a lot of work with the Students and New Professionals Committee, it's something that we face quite a lot as well. And I'm sure, David, you'll see it a lot with your students as well when people are trying to enter into the sector. And we had an event recently, and we were kind of chatting about the stats that have come up recently about the fact that quite often women feel like they have to meet every single requirement to apply for a job, or requirement, essential criteria, whatever the language is. Whereas men, quite often, they'll see like one or two and they'll still put themselves forward for it. And I think that's something that Amina Shah, the National Librarian for Scotland, spoke about in the chapter. Her kind of experience in the sector has been working with all of these incredible women, and she's obviously someone that has put herself forward to become the National Librarian, even though she still feels imposter syndrome. But she's seen all these women throughout her years in the sector who are incredible, and who she kind of explains it as these women know the library, they know the communities like the back of their hands, and yet they're not the ones that will put themselves forward into these middle management positions or senior management positions. So I think it's again that conversation that we were having earlier on about how we see women and people like us reflected in those roles. And if we don't see that, then it's impossible to figure out how we'll get there, and how the stepping stones just they don't really exist currently for women and for new professionals, especially, to be able to kind of see yourselves in that position.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about Amina's contributions to the conversation as well. It's incredible, and it's stayed with me ever since. And it's so wonderful that through the medium of podcast, you've been able to capture it, her voice literally as well as on the page. That idea actually that, well, firstly, recognising, and I would completely agree with this, I'm very much a feminist who thinks, and for the most part, our brains and our bodies are working just fine. So if you're getting those danger signals, you're getting the feeling you don't belong here, it might well be something in the environment telling you that that's true, whether that's historic, hopefully not in the present day, but it very likely will be. And I'm not going to, something that Leah and her interviewees touch on is that kind of inappropriate medicalization, which is something we see across feminist practice, or I should say across anti-feminist practice, something that feminist practice is trying to challenge. But this idea that there's something wrong with us, in fact, we might be feeling exactly what we're meant to feel. We don't belong in these spaces historically. And yeah, Amina articulates that really, really powerfully, but also therefore in a strange way, the provocation of imposter syndrome being your superpower. That if you're an imposter in a space, that means, yes, your voice hasn't been heard before, you haven't been represented before. Going back to our earlier discussion about EDI, David, and how quite often the sector can be tearing its hair out and how we represent more voices in more effective ways. Well, here we are, those who are feeling imposter syndrome, who are wondering whether or not they should cross that threshold, they belong in that space. Yes, you do. And the fact that you have that doubt tells us that the work continues.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting as well to touch back on that earlier point. One of the people that I interviewed for the book was Jill Ryan, who Kirsten mentioned earlier on, wrote the Wikimedia chapter. And I really wanted to get her perspective on it, not only as someone else who had been asked to write a chapter for the book and exploring how that might have been impacted her decision to say yes or no to the chapter, but she very much speaks about imposter syndrome as someone who comes from outside the library and information sector, but she comes from the education sector, and she mentions going back to university and in order to get her master's degree, so that she had the same level of qualifications as other people that had the roles that she wanted. And then when she entered into those roles, she discovered, actually, no one else here has the same qualification that I do. I'm actually overqualified now, but I still have that feeling of imposter syndrome. So she kind of explains it about trying to outrun these feelings of imposter syndrome. If I just do this one more thing, if I just reach this age, if I just get this qualification, then maybe I won't feel it anymore. But actually, she was like, I did all those things, I checked all those things off the list, and I still felt it. So very much back to your point, Kirsten, it is systemic, and it is these other kind of oppressive things that are kind of happening to women in the sector and that we're experiencing, and that is where it comes from, and that is why we need a kind of systematic rehaul, and I call it like a feminist overhaul of the system, to make sure that women aren't told that there's something wrong with us for feeling this way, because as you point out, it's exactly the way that we're meant to feel, and that's why the systems aren't working in our favor, and that is why we need to start to tackle them. And it's not a simple job. It's not like it's not a one size fits all approach either, because especially if we think about intersectionality as well, we are all experiencing the sector, we're all experiencing our own lives in different ways depending on these different factors like, class, race, sexuality, whatever it might be. And that's something that we really need to consider as well. But Sarah Louise McDonald speaks really eloquently in the chapter about the fact that community and grassroots activism are two of the things that we can really utilise, and that quite often we're already doing. And if we just pour a wee bit more energy into that work and do it in a kind of more systematic approach, then these are some of the things that we'll feel the benefit of a lot quicker. So she speaks really eloquently about that, and I don't think I could have really put it any better than I think she did, which is another benefit of the podcast chapter. You don't have to say it because someone else will.
I often think as well, like, how often imposter syndrome is looking at kind of someone above you in a job above you and thinking, you know what, I don't want that job because of the way they perform it. So, often it's that kind of dilemma as well. Like, you don't want to be that person.
Yeah.
And obviously in a profession where most of those roles are occupied by men, there's going to be a knock-on impact there, isn't there?
That's so interesting. It came up at one of the most recent workshops. A woman said to me, just actually quite candidly, once we'd finished the formal content, that I think part of the reason men are afraid of women having power is because they assume we'll abuse it the way they have. But that doesn't need to be the case. And as you say, Leah, a feminist overhaul would look quite different. I mean, I'm sure there'll be a lot of people listening thinking she could do with a touch more imposter syndrome at this point. But in that spirit, I mean, we've mentioned many times that this is the first offering in feminist librarianship. It's not the last. And for that exact reason, in my conclusion, well, firstly, I mentioned that I think probably about 75%, mirroring the sector's demographics of the women I approached, gave me a bit of a caveat before they began, said, are you sure I'm qualified? Are you sure I know enough? Are you sure I can do this? And think, let the editress worry about that. And I didn't need to worry about it, as it turns out. But it was really apparent, and I do wonder about all the men writing professional practice books, whether they had similar hesitancy. Although fair play to Sean, you did express a caution earlier on about being the right person to write the chapter. And I think you, like our authoresses, were very much the right person to write that. But I also begin the conclusion with again, tongue-in-cheek, that must be my my problem when I go into these the overarching sections. But I guess this is where I'm supposed to apologise. This is where, again, so often women are expected to be perfect or silent. We're supposed to have an answer to all or nothing at all. And that was just something I was not prepared to do with this book. It's the first word, it's not the last in feminist librarianship. So if something's missing, if something hasn't spoken to you, if there's more to be done, fantastic. Facet submission form is on their website. Nobody would be more delighted than me to see more work emerging as a result of this book.
Oh, absolutely. It's hopefully it's the start of a conversation that people want to take part in. And as you said, Facet are always looking for good books to get discussions flowing. So last couple of questions. And if you wanted a non-librarian listener to take one major lesson away from the Feminist Librarianship book, so hopefully there's a lot of non-librarians listening, what should that be then?
Hello, non-librarians. Thank you for supporting us. Thank you for returning your books in a timely fashion. I would say it is that investment in libraries is an investment in women, and therefore take that message. Actually, this is the call to action for you. We're doing the professional practice. We're making it happen however we can across all these different sectors, but the advocacy is in your hands. You're the voters. You're the ones the decision makers care about. I mean, we always joke at CILIPS, it's never going to be a headline, libraries body says protect libraries, but it will be if you do it. So really, I want to just offer this as advocacy ammunition. I want to see this message getting to decision makers. If cuts and closures to library service are proposed, have you thought about how this affects women and girls disproportionately? Not just, although that is very important from a legal perspective, from a quality impact assessment, but do you really realise that this is a women-fueled, women-power, women-infused sector that you are trying to decimate? And if so, why? As I concluded the menstrual literacy, we're bloody right to ask decision makers why, if they're not prepared to either invest in libraries or invest in women. So I think this has been hidden in plain sight for a long, long time within our advocacy. So really just taking that message from the implicit to the explicit. Investment in libraries is an investment in women.
Oh, that's a great message. So last question. I love really oomphy subtitles as your book has. So, principles, practices and provocations. So the provocations word especially jumped out at me. So what's the single most radical or provocative change you want to see implemented in the global library sector over the next decade?
Oh, I'd like to see more than one over the next decade. And yes, I love the provocations too. And obviously this is an audio medium, but if you see the book cover itself, you'll see that FAST have actually added little spikes to the provocations. So it really literally packs a punch. I think I want to see libraries understood the way that we've articulated throughout the past hour or so. I want to see people around the world recognising that libraries are, again, women-fueled, women-infused, and that not to be, therefore, how do we get more men into it, but something to celebrate, something to champion, especially when you know about the global sector, David. I'm thinking about our Sustainable Development Goals, which inform so much of our work. Goal 5, gender equality. Recognise that we cannot deliver on that goal without libraries, without what we offer our communities. In an ideal world, I think in the next decade, advocacy will not be necessary in the best possible way because we'll be too busy doing the work and it will be recognised. So I think, again, fusing that understanding of strong supported library services are strong supported women in your community and making sure that every decision maker hears that message and acts accordingly. And voters, if you don't think they've heard it, then you act accordingly as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Sean, for such a illuminating discussion, and highly recommend the book Feminist Librarianship, Principles, Practices and Provocations.